Hello, hello. Good afternoon.
Hi, welcome, Michelle. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our lecture series from Dr. Gouda. The previous lecture is about the deep structure of culture, and the topic for today is the necessity and methods of comparison. Welcome, Dr. Gouda.
Thank you. Thank you. So, shall I start now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. As you know, our topic today is about the necessity and the importance of comparison. And actually, there is a very interesting paper by Alan McFarlane called to contrast and compare. It's a bit theoretical, but it outlines to us the main idea and the main concepts and the structure of comparison and the difference between comparing and contrasting. So I will try to introduce to you this paper to familiarize ourselves with the theoretical frame of contrasting and comparing. And after that, there is another paper by Professor Zhang Dongxi, a very famous Chinese scholar. We can say it's a practical approach to comparison. And I will introduce to you that paper also, maybe in the second part of our lecture, which I find very interesting and very important. These two papers are so important for anyone who is interested in comparing comparative cultural studies in general and sinologies in particular. As I said last week, it's very important to compare between things. And actually, our minds work this way. It always works in a frame of comparison. We always compare between things. In our understanding of everything, it's always there is internal operation going on in our brain, comparing things together. For example, if you say about somebody, describe somebody that he is tall. Let's say somebody is, 180 centimeter, and you describe that person, let's call him Mr. Chan, for example. You describe Mr. Chan as a tall person. Why? Because you already made a comparison in your mind between his height and the average height. Let's say the average height is 170 centimeter, but that Mr. Chan, if he goes to Sweden, for example, this 180 centimeter will not be considered tall at all, because the average there is almost 180. So he has to be 190 in order to be called tall. But even that person, if he stands next to Yao Ming, for example, the Chinese basketball player, he will look small and short. So it's always comparative. And always, whenever we describe anything or whenever we understand anything, it always happens in a comparative mode. So as last week, Michelle asked me if the comparison will be in time between two different times. Of course, this is one part of having a comparison. Usually in history, when we study history, usually we compare between two times, like ancient times and modern times and so on. But in social studies, the comparison happens in spatial, it's in space, not in time, not temporal comparison, but spatial comparison. So here the comparison can be either synchronic, meaning the comparing between two things that happen or exist at the same time, or diachronic, that means two things, they happen in two different times. And the comparison here is spatial, not temporal. We understand everything through comparison. As I said, Evans Pritchard, he said, in the widest sense, there is no other method comparison is, of course, one of the essential procedures of all sciences and one of the elementary processes of human thoughts. So we are indulging ourselves in comparison all the time without being conscious of the comparison we are making all the time, even in the small details of our daily life. And I would quote also Rudyard Kipling here in his poem, The English Flag. He said, "And what should they know of England who only England know?" That means those who only know about England, English people, if they know this, that means they don't know England itself. They don't know their country itself. So we do not know our culture unless we compare it to or with another culture. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, one of the most important philosophers in the Enlightenment age, he said the views the most familiar to us are opt for that very reason to escape us. David Hume is a philosopher known of his philosophy of skepticism, and he encouraged his readers and encouraged us to be skeptical of everything, to question everything. Of course, we can disagree with him about certain things, like, for example, his denial of the first cause. But this point to be skeptic and to question everything, to question our own culture, our own habits, our own daily routines. This is, I find, very important, and actually helps us to understand our culture more and understand ourselves more. Karl Marx said, human history is like paleontology. Owing to a certain judicial blindness, even the best intelligences absolutely fail to see the things which lie in front of their nose. We fail to see things that are so close to us. And because they are so close to us, we fail to see them. We fail to see things that's so familiar to us. I remember there is an Indian thinker. He once gave a lecture, and he said, if somebody, for example, didn't brush his teeth for 3 days, you can smell him like if 1 meter away, but we cannot, or we do not smell our own mouth if we didn't brush our teeth for even a week. We do not smell our own mouth, even though the distance between our nose and our mouth is so short. It's almost like 1 centimeter, but we cannot, and we do not smell it. This is exactly falls in line with this same idea. We are apt to overlook the things that are very familiar and so close to us. And I will come to this point in the second part of our lecture, and I will introduce to you another paper, and based on a Chinese poem that really reflects this point so well. So the purpose of comparisons, why do we, of course, as I said already, it's very important to do comparison. It helps us to understand our own culture and our own selves. But how about the mechanism of this comparison? How to do it, the right steps to do comparison. This is very important topic to scholars, no matter what discipline they are specialized in, and very important to students also, undergraduate or postgraduate students who try to write an essay or a paper trying to compare between two things, two texts or two cultures, two civilizations, whether they are students of literature or comparative cultural studies or whatever. So there are certain mechanisms we need to follow when we do any comparison. First thing, the first phase, let's call them 2 phases. The first phase, the first stage is asking questions. The second stage is testing answers. We ask questions first. We try to come up with some questions and certain hypotheses, and then we try to test the answers we may have. The first thing when in the first stage of asking questions or suggesting questions, posing questions, the first thing we should do is distancing the overfamiliar. What is the overfamiliar? Is our daily routine, our local and native culture. We need to distance ourselves. This is just reflects what I have just said and all the quotes I have just read by Karl Marx and David Hume. We need to distance ourselves a little bit from our native and local culture in order to see our culture with fresh eyes, to see our culture anew. Okay, so the first thing we need to do here is a reverse telescope. Telescope, usually we use it in order to see the minute microbes that we need to magnify them under the telescope by maybe millions of times in order to see the microbes and the viruses. But here we need to use this technique that's reverse telescope, reverse, to look at it from distance, to look at the familiar, the over-familiar habits, thoughts, things from a distance. We look at what we do as though we are strangers to ourselves, with foreign eyes. In other words, we turn the obvious into unobvious. We turn the obvious. This is something actually for those who lived overseas, and when they return to their homeland after a few years of living abroad, they can see things that they failed to see when they were living in their homeland. After being away from their homeland for a few years, and when they go back, they start to see things differently, and they wonder why people speak in this way. Why my own people? This, you are talking about your own people. Why your own people speak in this way or think? You start to see things differently. So the most popular is opt to escape us, as David Hume said. For example, the fish in the water. The fish is the last creature that can realize the existence of water, because the fish lives in the water all the time. All the time. That's why it can't really realize the existence of water. The same way with the birds in the air. The birds in the air also opt to miss the existence of the air, and we realize the existence of these things only when we get a problem related to them. Like, for example, we never realize that we are fine and healthy unless we fall sick. So like having headache, for example, or stomach ache, and then we start to feel that we start to be conscious of our internal organs only when we got trouble. So here, when we describe any society, even our own society, we need to look at it as a foreign society. We need to look at it as when we go overseas, for example, and live in a foreign society, what we notice right away is the things that attract our eyes. It's not the common. If you go, for example, you as a Chinese person, you go to Japan, you will not notice that the people are using chopsticks, because this is something you also do. But you notice the things that they do and you do not do in your country. Okay, we always notice the unfamiliar when we leave our country. So only by contrast there can be full understanding. Contrasting things A and B through this comparison and contrasting, there can be full understanding. The second thing we should do is familiarizing the distance. Familiarizing. When we go overseas, maybe the whole society we live in is so foreign to us. So we need to familiarize ourselves with this foreign culture. So we need here to use a technique called a telescope view. This is not a reverse telescope. No. We use the telescope in the usual way, meaning to magnify things, meaning we get closer to that local to that foreign society, which is foreign to us. Okay, you go to live in Canada, for example, in France, in Germany, wherever, it's a foreign society to you. People do things and behave in a certain way that's foreign to you. So here you need to use this telescope view in order to get closer to their culture, in order to understand their culture and understand why they behave in such a way and why they speak or do these things. David Hume says, regarding this foreign phenomenon, whatever we see, things that foreign to us, sometimes they sound and they seem irrational and nonsense. In this respect, David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, said, "Let an object be presented to a man of never so strong natural reason and abilities," meaning somebody who is not strong, not intellectual, not smart, somebody who is not intellectual, not smart, okay, not intelligent. If that object be entirely new to him, he will not be able, by the most accurate examination of its sensible qualities, to discover any of its causes or effects. Meaning, it needs intelligence in order to understand a foreign culture, to understand its causes and effects. It needs intelligence. And also, we need to think of possible alternative models of things. We always need to think of a third alternative. What if the situation was this? What if we behave differently? What if we always try to come up with or provide a new hypothesis? What if something happens? What if we do things differently, and so on? This is all about asking questions. Also, it's about asking questions regarding things that are not there, things that are absent. This is making absences visible, revealing absences, meaning whether we talk about our society or about foreign society, when we try to make any comparison, we always should ask about the things that do not exist in that society. Not only about the things that exist in the society and the things that we experience, but we also should ask about the things that do not exist at all, or existed at a certain time and then ceased to exist. For example, these reversing questions. If someone asked the scholar about the ancestor worship in Japan, why does it still exist in Japan? And he turned the question upside down and he said, this is not an interesting question. The interesting question is to ask why it died out in the West. Why it died out. So here you ask about what is missing. You don't only have to ask about the things you experience. You can also ask about the things that do not exist, the things that are missing, the absent things. Here, we do not say that asking why the ancestor worship still exists in Japan. We don't say that this question is not interesting. It is interesting, but it might be more interesting, or it may add a certain or a deeper dimension if we ask why it died out in the West or in another part of the world. So we always need to ask about the interesting things that either happened in the past and ceased to exist anymore, or about things that did not happen at all. So we use this comparative framework as a backcloth, as a background to project the foreground. What is the foreground here? The foreground here is our culture. Is then like you compare A to B or A with B. A is your culture, for example, your native culture, but you need a background of a foreign culture, okay, in order to project your own culture, in order to understand your own culture, not only understanding the foreign culture. And so we need to pay attention and to put equal emphasis on both similarities and dissimilarities, similarities and differences. Not only, of course, when we contrast between two things, we focus only on the differences, okay? But when we compare, we focus on both similarities and dissimilarities or differences. After finishing this stage, then we come to the testing answers. We need to test our answers. We need to test the hypothesis we have put forward to see if our hypothesis is correct or not, whatever hypothesis we may put forward. And actually, this is also very scientific method because science is based on hypothesis. All scientists, they have to provide and pose an hypothesis first, and they try so many experiments one after another to test this hypothesis to see if they work or not. We also need, when we test our answers, we need to search for causal connections. Causal, always ask why and how, why things happen this way and how it happened. Trying to find the causal connection, the reason, the cause and effect. For example, we can ask questions, and this example has been brought forward by Max Weber, the German sociologist and anthropologist. Like Calvinism, for example, he suggested that Calvinism is the root of capitalism. Calvinism is let's say, is a branch of the French branch of Protestantism. Okay, Protestantism is a Christian sect that started by Martin Luther in 1517, exactly on the 31st of October 1517, when he went to the church and he put 99 objections that he protested against the church in Rome, the Catholic Church in Rome, and that's why his sect later on became to be known as Protestantism, because they protested against the authority of the church and so on. So, for example, Max Weber, he said that Calvinism is the root of capitalism, of our modern capitalism, and also suggested to ask questions like, are there capitalist societies that are not Calvinists? And to compare between a society, if this kind of society exists, to compare between this kind of society that is capitalist and Calvinist and another society that's only capitalist but not Calvinist. The idea is always to get ourselves used to ask questions and to find these causal connections between things. And also searching for more co-variations beyond our society, like imagining a different type, a different pattern of society. Not only the society we live in, but other variations of this society. Always we need to give our imagination, freedom to imagine things that do not really exist. Also, the generalizations, even though historians, some of them, they claim that they don't pass any general statements, but usually they do. And we need to test this generalization. Whatever general statement we'll make, we need to test them and examine them cross-comparatively. Like comparing between, for example, if we talk about, as an example, between the English law, in order to understand it, if we talk about it and if we want to understand it, we need to understand it against a backdrop of the law of Western Europe, for example. And also we can examine a single system and compare it with a whole system, like comparing, for example, civilization, between one civilization and another. And this is very essential in order to for scholars in order to understand their own civilization. And this is something Western scholars did all the time, comparing Western civilizations to Eastern civilizations in general, and to selecting one civilization like Japanese civilization or Indian civilization or Chinese civilization, and comparing between Western civilization and let's say Indian or Chinese civilization. And sometimes they choose three different civilizations to compare between each other. So the methods of comparison here, if we talk, for example, about Emil Durkheim's, he has three types of approaches to do comparison. The first comparison, the first method is a single society at a given time, and we analyze its broad variations in certain modes or action. For example, we will analyze smoking in Hong Kong. Only Hong Kong, or only Beijing, or only Shanghai. We don't compare it to another or with another city. No, we look at this phenomenon, smoking, for example, and we compare between a phenomenon, for example, in the higher class or the middle class, or between workers class, or between one part in Hong Kong and another part, and put it in different modes. So it's within one single society. The second approach, we compare between several societies of generally similar nature, but differ in certain modes, like smoking in Hong Kong and Japan, Hong Kong or Shanghai and Japan, for example, or Shanghai and Hong Kong. They are similar in many things, that they are both Asian, they are both Asian, and they are both metropolitan cities and so on, but they are still different in many other ways. So we can hold this. Another approach is to compare between two societies. We select one phenomenon, for example, and compare between this phenomenon in one society and the same phenomenon in another society. The third approach, numerous societies, widely different in nature, yet sharing some identical features, or different periods showing radical changes in the same society. Different periods, like selecting or picking one phenomenon and comparing between that phenomenon 100 years ago and the same phenomenon in our time now, within the same society, or within or in more than two societies. So these are three types of approaches to do comparisons according to Emil Durkheim. The unit of comparisons. What kind of things are suitable for comparisons? Because there are certain things are not suitable for comparisons. We need to compare between two things that they have some common characteristics. They are different in some ways, but they are similar in some ways too. So we need to compare between things of the same order of magnitude. That's why we cannot compare, for example, between handshake in England and the family system in China. The handshake in England is a tiny social behavior, small social behavior. We cannot compare it with such magnitude, such a major social system like the family system in China. They don't match, okay? The other thing is to compare things of the same class or same order. That's why we cannot compare between marriage in America, for example, and tea drinking in China. They don't belong to the same family. They are completely different in nature. We cannot make this comparison. That's why when we make any comparison, we need to make sure that the unit of comparison, unit here meaning objects, the object we compare or we use for our comparison, they have to match. There must be some connection between these two things. They belong to the same family, for example, and so on. And comparing relations of things, not things. When we compare between two things, two objects, two units, We don't compare between things in themselves. We compare between their values, their relationships to the people, for example. When we compare between marriage in America or in the West and marriage in China, we don't compare between the marriage itself in itself, but the value behind it, the relationship between that thing and the society itself, for example. There are also two types of comparison. One is called controlled comparison and one is general comparison. The general comparison is general comparison, like comparing between two civilizations, for example. But the limited or the controlled comparison, the range of differences is limited. And here Edward Luhr says, the controlled comparison is the methods of intensively comparing groups of common derivation or with a basically identical culture, yet differing in some specific factor. The point being to ascertain what other elements likewise differ. So actually contrast and compare it, there are two different things. As I said earlier, to contrast is to focus on the dissimilarity, on the differences. You need to compare between two things that they are more different than united or similar. While comparing, you focus on both. You focus on the similarities and the dissimilarities. Some scholars prefer to focus on the contrast, while others prefer to focus on the comparison. Which one is better? When you want to make a comparison, you need to decide for yourselves first, before you start making this comparison, which side you want to focus on more. You want to focus on the differences or the similarities or both. As I said, scholars had different opinions regarding it. For example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher who lived from 1712 to 1778, he said, one needs to look near at hand if one wants to study men, but to study men, one must learn to look from afar, from distance. So this falls in line with what we said earlier, to distance ourselves from the over familiar. Because we live in community with people, we are so close to people. But in order to study these people around us, we need to distance ourselves from them a little bit in order to understand them. One must first observe differences in order to discover attributes. In order to discover the similarities between two things, we need first to observe the differences. So here we find that Jean-Jacques Rousseau prefers to focus on the differences, not on the similarities. Evans Pritchard said, I would like to place emphasis on the importance for social anthropology as a comparative discipline of differences, because it could be held that in the past, the tendency has often been to place stress on similarities, whereas it is the differences which would seem to invite sociological explanation. So this is involved question for institutions have to be similar in some respects before they can be different in others. Another one, David Francis Pocock, more formal comparison is both possible and desirable. But here again, the concern will be not with similarities only, but with differences also for the sake of heightened understanding. So some scholars prefer to focus on the differences, while others prefer to focus on the similarities. But according to Alan McFarlane, it's better to focus on both. It's when we make any comparison, it's better to focus on both similarities and dissimilarities and differences. Now, how many polars, if we want to make a comparison, how many polars we can use? And like comparing between two things or three or five, how many things we can use, how many units we can use. Wright Mills says often you get the best insights by considering extremes, different polars. By thinking of the opposite of that with which you are directly concerned. If you think about despair, then also think about elation. If you study the miser, then also the spendthrift. When you pick something to understand it or to make a comparison between it and something else, try to find the other side of, or the opposite, the complete opposite of that thing. It's polar, it's extreme opposite, in order to project each other. And it's desirable to have as many as you can, more than two, not just two units, comparing between two units. So to contrast is only a start. We only try to find differences just as a start to have a true comparison. A true comparison is based on both similarities and differences. This is nowadays, modern scholars, they tend to have this understanding and to follow this line, that the true comparison is based on both. And to, as I said, to have as many as possible. How many poles of comparison here? As I said earlier, we cannot just randomly pick out any two objects to make comparisons. No, they have to be of similar nature. And the method of contrast is based on dichotomies, with one seen as the normal, which is, let's say, your culture. Your culture, you will consider it the normal, the natural, and the other as deviation, as the other, or something different from your culture. And it's better to choose a triadic mode, meaning more than two, meaning three objects to make a comparison. I remember when I did my PhD dissertation, it was a comparative study of prosody, Western prosody, Chinese prosody, and Arabic prosody. Prosody is the study of meter, by the way. The study of meter is the rhythm of poetry. Okay, so I chose 5 poetics, different poetics. Arabic, Chinese, English, French, and German. And my professor, my supervisor, was Professor Zhang Hongxi. Then one day I asked him, is it better to just focus on Arabic, English, and Chinese? Because I feel, at that time, I felt that 5 poetics might be too many. And he said, no, the more the better. Since it's a comparison, then the more the better. The more you have, the richer your comparison will be. And I discovered later on that his opinion was quite true. So also there is another thing called an ideal type that was said by Max Weber. He's German, so Max Weber. He called it Gedankenbilder. Gedankenbilder is also to imagine an ideal object or an ideal phenomenon, ideal behavior, ideal society. So when you compare, for example, between two things, maybe one of these two things is just imaginary, is not real. You compare between your society now and what it should be, between what your behavior now and how you should behave. For example, something that doesn't exist, but you imagine it as an ideal type. He called it Gedankenbilder. And Alan McFarlane also agrees with that. And he also adds his own understanding by saying this triangulation. Triangulation is to add a third element. If you compare between A and B, then try to add C also, to compare between these three things. That will make sure you don't take sides. Like if you compare between China and Japan, then try to include, China and America, for example. If you compare between in anything, select any topic, and you could take China and America as examples to make the comparison, then it would be your comparison or your study would be more interesting if you add Japan as well. Why? Because Japan has similarities and dissimilarities with both sides. Japan is similar to China, that it is an Asian country, and it is similar to America also because it's very westernized. So in a way, it falls in the middle between China and America. So when you make this comparison using this triangulation of comparison as suggested by Alan McFarlane, your comparison will be more interesting and very rich. And this is, many scholars did that, like Tocqueville, he compared between France, England, and America. France, England, America. The comparison is between France and America, but then he included England as just a middle party between France and America. Norman Jacobs could compare between China, Japan, and Europe. Again, the comparison between China and Europe, but Japan acts as a middle factor here, and so on. Between India, Europe, Japan, the comparison between India and Japan, but Europe acts as just a middle factor between them. So we also try, the comparison would be so important if we add this Gedankenbilder, or the ideal type, the thing that does not exist except in our mind. We imagine it to be there. We'll compare between what our behavior, our present behavior, and our future behavior, our ideal behavior, how we should behave, for example, okay? And we may include triangulation, the third party. Okay. Before I move to the next paper, if you have any questions so far, this is the theoretical frame of comparison and contrasting. If you have any question, if there is anything unclear, difficult, a bit abstract, you need me to further explain it, to go through it again, please let me know. If not, I will talk about another, we'll take a Chinese poem, okay, and we'll try to demonstrate this distancing the over-familiar and familiarizing the distant on that Chinese poem. So it will be like practical application of this comparison, and also a study in how Western scholars study Chinese history, and the dichotomy between Western scholars, sinologists, and Chinese scholars regarding studying Chinese history. So if there's anything unclear about this theoretical introduction, please feel free to ask me now before I resume. Is there any question? If you have no question, then I will go on. I'll show you the slides very quickly. So if you have anything unclear, you can ask me. I recommend this paper to you too. You can download it online. It's called To Contrast and Compare. by Alan McFarlane. You can find the PDF online. It's very interesting and not that difficult to understand. Okay, if there is no question, so maybe I should go on, all right? The other paper is by Professor Zhang Rongxi, and it's called Lessons from Mount Lu, China and Cross-Cultural Understanding. Mount Lu is a mount in China, Lushan, okay, and there is a very famous poem by Su Shi. The poem, this is the translation of Professor Zhang Rongxi. 横看成岭侧成峰，远近高低各不同。And there is another version for it. 到处看山了不同，不识庐山真面目，追问身在此山中。His translation goes like this: viewed horizontally, a range, a cliff from the side. It differs as we move high or low, or far or nearby. We do not know the true face of Mount Lu because we are all ourselves inside. This is a very famous poem in classical Chinese literature, and especially the last two lines. The last two lines, we do not know the true face of Mount Lu because we are all ourselves inside. What does it mean when we read? What is the first impression we get when we read such a poem? What does Su Shi try to say in such a poem? Of course, the first impression we get, and so many people understand the poem in this way, is that since we are so close to Mount Lu, we shall not see it truly. We shall not see and shall never know the true essence and the true face of Mount Lu. That means, it means if we distance ourselves, if we go farther from Mount Lu, we will be able to see it clearly and to get a better idea and better understanding and better view of Mount Lu. If we take this example in sinologies and the study of Chinese culture, does it mean that Chinese native scholars, they cannot understand Chinese history as much as Western scholars? Because Western scholars, they are not inside the Mount Lu, they are not Chinese. According to the poem, understanding the poem just judging at surface level, it's Chinese scholars will not fully understand Chinese history because they are Chinese. So Chinese history is so close to them. They live in this history. But we need a scholar who is an outsider to understand, to look at that history and understand it. And those outsiders, those scholars, Western scholars, for example, they are able to understand Chinese history and Chinese literature better than native speakers. There are many people understand the poem in this way, but Professor Zhang Rongxi, he offers a different understanding, a different explanation. First, in his paper, he talked about sinology and sinologists as outsiders. They are the outsiders who study Chinese history from distance. So the question he poses here, are they able to understand this Chinese history better than Chinese people, Chinese scholars? And China itself, China and Chinese history has been taken as an object studied by by Western scholars. And when Western scholars study Chinese history, they use Western theories and Western measures and Western stick yards to measure and to understand and to analyze Chinese history. Zhang Longxi goes against that. And what he says is that Western theories and Western measures, methodologies, not necessarily suitable to understand and to analyze Chinese history that's lived by Chinese people and experienced by Chinese people. And sometimes this native understanding is so essential and we cannot just get rid of. So in this paper, he advocates having or striking a balance between the understanding and of the outsider, the Western scholars, their approach, and the approach of Chinese scholars. So let's go through it with some more details. There is a scholar called Paul Cohen. Actually, Professor Zhang Longxi quoted him several times because that scholar, that American scholar, he also noticed the problem. He also noticed that these Western scholars who use Western theories and methodologies to analyze and to explain Chinese history, they have some problems. And they cannot fully understand the Chinese history if they follow this way. So he divided, what he did, that he divided the Chinese history, the recent Chinese history into three paradigms. One is from the 1860, let's say from the Opium War until the New China, until 1911. Another phase, and that, for example, of course, that first phase, China was very weak, received Western influence and was weak at that time. Then after the establishment of and the rise of New China in 1911, until, let's say, 1960s, that's the second stage in which China tried to be modernized, to be a modern country, and to follow the footsteps of the West. And after that, from 1960s until our time, some Chinese progressive scholars, they started to project how the Western imperialism crippled the Chinese progress, crippled China's progress in its way to modernization, to be a modern country. So against this Western-centric approach that was adopted and followed by Western scholars, he suggested, Paul Cohen, he suggested a new approach that is China-centric. China-centric meaning we understand and we study China history, the Chinese history from native point of view, from Chinese perspective. We need to understand, we need to study Chinese history from a Chinese point of view. Okay, what Chinese scholars said about their history, how they lived and how they experienced their own history, how they expressed it. We need to bear all this in mind, and we need also to take this approach in order to understand the Chinese history. He says China problems in the double sense that they are experienced in China by Chinese, and the measure of their historical importance is Chinese, rather than a Western measure. This approach is called China-centric approach. Okay, so he said these are Chinese problems. When this Chinese history is a Chinese problem, is a Chinese object. So we need to put it in a Chinese context in order to understand it. An individual experience rather than the totality of historical experience we call China or Chinese history as a whole. So here it's very difficult to understand history as a whole. Usually when any scholar writes about history, he writes about history from his own point of view. So again, it's an individual experience about a certain time, a certain incident in time. It's not about the Chinese history as a whole, not about the totality of historical experience. And so we read different opinions offered by different scholars because each of them actually provides his own individual experience and understanding of history. And also he says how the infinite, how that infinite understanding is possible for finite human nature. To understand history as a whole is something almost infinite, is something very, very difficult. It's very difficult for one person, one scholar who is finite to understand that infinite history. How can one be omnipresent, to be everywhere, to understand what has happened in history at the same time in different places? So he offers this approach, how to study Chinese history, which is so huge and stretches throughout thousands of years. How for one scholar to understand all this history like that? So he suggested to divide it into small parts. And instead to use this China-centric, he suggested something region-centered, not China-centered, like dividing China horizontally into cities and provinces and study each part alone. So it's region-centered, not China-centered. And also using Western theories and methodologies of Western social sciences. But while we use their methodologies, we have to bear in mind and to have also this native point of view, from native perspective. We look at the Chinese history from native perspective while using Western theories. So here, this is very close to what we have just said earlier about familiarizing the distance and distancing ourselves from the over-familiar. It combines both. This is the practical application of those two steps, the reverse telescope technique and the telescope technique. So Professor Zhang here, he asks, are the inside and outside mutually exclusive? Can't they coexist? Can't we have both of them, both the native, the Chinese perspective and the Western perspective in order to understand the Chinese history? This is what he advocates and this is what he defends. This is his opinion that he says, yes, we can. All right. But here he launches his criticism against Western scholars in general, that they, for several decades, they took China as quite the opposite of the West. And even though some says that thing started by French scholars, he said, no, it didn't start by French scholars. We also find American scholars follow the same way. They also look at China and Chinese culture as quite the opposite of Western culture, quite the opposite, like the other, l'autre in French, l'autre, the other, cital, the other. China is the other of, quite the opposite of Western civilization, Western culture, and so on. So Foucault, Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, he came up with this expression, heterotopia. Hetero meaning other. Topia is place. It's like utopia. Like utopia, for example, when you say utopia, you know utopia, right? It's the very famous novel by Thomas More. It's this perfect world, the imaginary perfect. We imagine that there's a perfect world. And it has two pronunciation. One is utopia, utopia. O here, it's Latin, of course, all right? This is not English. It's Latin. So O here meaning no, and topia meaning place. So utopia meaning, if you pronounce it as utopia, it means no place, meaning it's a perfect place that doesn't exist. Too perfect, so perfect that it doesn't exist in reality. Or you can pronounce it as utopia, and you here meaning good. So utopia meaning good place. Utopia, okay? So here Foucault, hetero meaning other, heterotopia meaning other place. So China is the heterotopia. To Michel Foucault, China is the heterotopia, the other country, the other place. There is West and there is China, okay? L'autre in France. And Derrida said the same thing. And he said China, of course, Derrida is famous for this concept of différance. It's pronounced différance, but it can be written, spelled differently, but it's the same pronunciation. So Derrida also said China is a perfect example of this différance, of what is different, completely different from Western culture. There are other scholars also. As I just said, some scholars said, oh, the other, taking China as the other, the opposite of Western culture, is mainly French product. It's French scholars who started it. And then Professor Zhang countered this claim and says, no, even American scholars did that, and he gives some examples of to show how also the French scholars, some of them were so extremist in the way they depicted China and introduced China. Like, for example, François Julien, he always, in many of his writings, he always compared between China and Greece, and especially between ancient China and ancient Greece, and always introduced China and Chinese culture and Chinese civilization as quite the opposite of ancient Greece, quite the opposite. Like he introduces two columns, and this is what's done in China, this is what's done in Greece, and they're always completely the opposite, okay? And he says here, China presents a case study through which to contemplate Western thought, meaning through China, through studying China, we understand, because it's quite the opposite of Western culture, then we will come to a point where we understand Western culture, where Western thought from the outside. And he said, strictly speaking, non-Europe is China. This is all quotes, okay? This is quotes. He says, strictly speaking, non-Europe is China, and it cannot be anything else. China cannot be anything else but non-Europe, meaning the other that's not Western, the other that's not European. Marcel Grany also described China and Chinese way of thinking. He called it la pensée chinoise. La pensée chinoise, and he also called it la pensée, la chinoise mentality, the Chinese mentality, or the Chinese thought, and also introduced it in a way that there is Western thought, and the opposite of it is the Chinese thought. Jacques Grenier, he actually explained and justified the failure of the Western missionaries in China due to the different modes of thoughts. Different mode. He said that the Chinese mentality, the Chinese mode of thoughts are so different, the opposite of the Western mode of thought. That's why Christian missionaries have failed in China. And actually, when we look at this point, we find something very similar in Japan. Japan also, what's his name? Shusaku Endo, the Japanese novelist, Shusaku Endo. He was converted or born Catholic, I think. I don't remember whether he was born Catholic or converted to Catholicism since he was small. Anyhow, he wrote two very famous novels. One is called Silence, and the other one is called The Samurai. And in the two novels, they are almost based on true stories about the Christian missionaries to Japan in the 17th, 18th centuries. 18th centuries, I think, and how they failed. And he's a Japanese, okay? He was a Japanese, very famous novelist, very, very good novelist. And he was also translated into Chinese, actually. And he also, that was his opinion. What he tried to say in these two novels is that even though he was Japanese, but that's his analysis, that the Japanese mentality is so different from Western mentality that they completely reject anything foreign coming to them. That's why they rejected any Western religion coming to them. So this point is very similar to what they say here, to what Jack Gurney say here. So China as the other, when those Western scholars, when they look at China as the other, this is contrastive methods, because they only focus on the differences, on how China is different. They don't try to find a common ground, common characteristics, some similarities between what is Chinese and what is Western. They only focus on the differences. So this is a contrastive method. Richard Nesbitt, for example, he doesn't agree with that. He says members of different cultures differ in their metaphysics or fundamental belief about the nature of the world. The characteristic thought process of different groups differ greatly. No, actually, he's still like falling in line with the same idea that he says that Chinese understanding of what is metaphysical is so different from the West. The metaphysical, of course, is, or what's metaphysics is the other life after death. But here, starting from here, we return to Cohen. He introduces this comparative method, not the contrastive method, not just focusing on differences, but focusing on both similarities and dissimilarities. So Cohen here, as I said, he called for this China-centered approach. And he said China-centered approach tries to get inside China. Get inside China, meaning to understand history, Chinese history, the way Chinese people understand it. Why? To reconstruct Chinese history as far as possible as the Chinese themselves experience it. So from what he says, it's very, very clear that he's using comparative methods, not contrastive methods. Professor Zhang Longxi calls this Western attitude, the way they study Chinese history and the way they apply Chinese Western methodologies and Western theories on Chinese phenomena, he calls it social science arrogance. It's their arrogance that what fits them must fit also other people or other nations. Okay, and that they should or could understand the history better than the natives. So instead, he says, instead of this arrogance, this social science arrogance, instead of a humble acknowledgement that we do not know the true face of Mount Lu. Now he quotes the final part, final line of the third line in the poem, that we, no matter whether we are Chinese or Westerners, we will never know the true face of Mount Lu. Unless through, it will always be a comparative question. And we need a compromise. We need different perspectives in order to understand history. And here he will come to offer his own understanding and his own explanation of the poem at the end of his paper. For example, some Western scholars pose the question, is China a nation state? And a nation state, as a definition of nation state, let's take this definition by Emmanuel Wallerstein. He said the modern state is a sovereign state. Sovereignty is a concept that was invented in the modern world system. So because this modern state as a concept, it was invented in the West, does it mean that China before the 17th century, was it also a nation state? Did it have a nation state? Or as they say, some Western scholars, they posed this question, or was it just an imagined community? Imagined community. China before the 17th century was an imagined community. It became a nation state only in the 20th century, according to the understanding of some Western scholars. And here, there is a Chinese scholar called Ge Zhaoguang. I hope that the name of this book is clear. This book is very interesting book, and he's a professor in food industry. And actually, I was lucky to meet him personally because he was invited to come to the City University of Hong Kong and to deliver a lecture there, a lecture based on this book. And actually, of course, he contradicted that understanding that China, throughout thousands of years, was a nation state and had its own personality as a nation, its own characteristics as a nation, unified the language, the writing system, and so many things, the moral principles, the customs, the political systems. All this began thousands of years, at least 3,000 years ago. And so China thus should not be judged according or measured according to some Western understanding of Western methodologies. So this nation state, this modern nation state, cannot be applied to the ancient history of China, because that nation state of China existed well before the 17th century. So if I read this quote quickly, different from Europe, China's political territory and cultural space spread out from the center toward the peripheries, even without mentioning the pre-Qin antiquity, at least from the time of the Qin and the Han dynasties. By unifying the width of vehicle tracks, unifying the written scripts, and unifying moral codes, language and writing, moral principles and customs, and the political system began to gradually stabilize the nation within this space. And this is quite different from the European understanding of the nation as a new phenomenon in late human history. Okay, this is a very interesting and very powerful argument. I also suggest you to get this book and read it if you are interested. He also says the theory that separates traditional empires and modern states into two different eras does not fit in well with Chinese history, nor does it fit the Chinese consciousness of a nation or the history of the emergence of a nation. So in other words, he says this Western measures, Western understanding doesn't really fit the Chinese history, is not suitable to understand Chinese history. Now we come to the poem again. Does the poem indicate that only outsiders would understand history better than the native people, native Chinese, for example? If we talk about Chinese history, is that what the poem says? Zhang Longxi says no, it doesn't say so. He says, okay, viewed horizontally, arrange. When that mountain viewed horizontally, it's like a range of mountains. Okay, a cliff from the side. It differs as we move high or low, or far or nearby. We do not know the true face of Mount Lu because we are all ourselves inside. Here, Zhang Longxi says that the poem doesn't say that outsiders will understand Mount Lu or see Mount Lu better or have a better view of Mount Lu if they are distant. The poem doesn't say that. The poem just says that Mount Lu looks different from different perspectives. And no matter what perspective you use to look at Mount Lu, it will always look different. Whether you are inside or outside, it will look different. The poem doesn't say that only outsiders will know the true face of Mount Lu, because actually, according to the poem, there is no true face. There is no one single true face of Mount Lu. Mount Lu has so many different faces. It depends on the perspective you look at it. E.H. Carr, he said, it does not follow that he would take the Mount Lu as a metaphor for history, metaphor for understanding Chinese history. So let us consider this Mount Lu as Chinese history, and which approach, which way to study this history is the best. He says here, it does not follow that because a mountain appears to take on different shapes from different angles of vision, it has objectively either no shape at all or an infinity of shapes. It does not follow that because interpretation plays a necessary part in establishing the facts of history, and because no existing interpretation is wholly objective, one interpretation is as good as another, and the facts of history are in principle not amenable to objective interpretation. So he says here there is no objective interpretation for history. There is no objective interpretation. Any interpretation of history is somehow subjective. And that's why one interpretation might be as good as another. What Zhang Longxi offers here, the right way to do comparison, the right way to study history, to study any phenomenon, if you want to put it in a larger scope, this plurality, to adopt plurality of views, plurality of views. And if we put it in line with what we have said earlier at the beginning of our talk, is to distance the familiar and to familiarize the foreign phenomenon. So there is no certain view is best. It's not by getting too close or by staying so far. It's by combining both, by adopting both. We need both techniques, both methods in order to have a better understanding. No one can claim. He said, we don't claim that one of them is better than the other. No one can claim that, but we need both in order to have a better understanding of history. of any historical phenomenon we study. And he says the more instructive poem, the poem is more instructive poem than a simple description of mountain. It's not just it's like he's telling us a message. Susha is like telling us a message that there is no one true face of Mount Lu. Whether you look at it from close distance or from or far away, there is no one true face. At best, insiders and outsiders are all limited in their respective horizons. This part is very powerful. Are all limited in their respective horizons and finite determinacy. And at worst, the insiders' blind spots. These Western scholars who say the insiders, the Chinese scholars, they have these blind spots because they are so close to their history. There are certain things, many things they do not see. Of course, they have a point. Of course, to a certain extent, it's true, okay? But the alternative is not to discard this native approach completely and say that the Western understanding and approach is the only way of understanding. No, no one can say that. We must strike a balance between the two understandings, between the two approaches. The Chinese approach, understanding their experience, and also we use the Western methodology and theories, but accompanied with Chinese native perspective. So this final part is very interesting. And at worst, the insiders' blind spots are matched only by the outsiders' ignorance and lack of sensitivity. This is very important, because if we say, oh, Chinese scholars, because they are native people, that's why they have these blind spots. There are many things they will overlook. Okay, this is matched, at worst, this is matched by the outsiders' ignorance of an insensitivity and understanding of the local culture. Okay, so we can't say that both are wrong or both are correct. We need both ways in order to have a better understanding. Robert Burton says we are all, of course, both insiders and outsiders, members of some groups. And here, this quotes here is about we all belong to some societies, to some groups, some social groups. We all have more than one identity. Okay, it's not only if you are Chinese, then this is your identity, but you are also Asian. Identity you add to your first identity, and so on. A British guy from an English guy, he's English, but he's European, and he's Western, and so on. There are several. This is Amartya Sen also says that we have different identities, and that's why understanding and explaining history is not an easy thing. It's always subjective. And why it's subjective? Because we have different identities. We belong to different social groups. We belong to this group, not that group. And also it's like circle. One circle contains another circle, and so on. We are all, Amartya said, we are all individually involved in identities of various kinds in disparate contexts in our own respective lives. Let us end by reading how Zhang Nongxi ended the paper, his paper. It's, again, you can find this paper online. It's very interesting. Let me give you the title, show you the title. It's called Lessons from Mount Lu, China and Cross-Cultural Understanding. Lessons from Mount Lu by Zhang Nongxi. You can find it as a PDF. You can download it to read it. It's you will enjoy it. It's very interesting. So let us here says, with such an insight into our plural and interrelated statuses or multiple identities, we may now realize that it is untenable to hold that only Chinese can understand China, or equally absurdly, that only a Western scholar can provide an outsider's objective view. Because whether we like it or not, our understanding will always be subjective. I dare to say there is nothing called objective. We will always be subjective. Subjective, we are restricted and limited by our own culture and by our own education. So whatever our understanding will be, it will always be subjective. And thus provide us with true knowledge about China. So neither the Chinese way is the best way or the Western way is the best way. We need to have both. And they say, understanding China and Chinese history requires integration of different views from different perspectives. But such integration is not a simple juxtaposition of insiders and outsiders views. It doesn't mean we combine the two views and that's it. We'll take something from here and something from there. No, it's more complex than that, of course. It is more of an act of integration and mutual illumination than simply adding up native Chinese scholarship and Western sinology. Su Shi's poem on Mount Lu is more instructive than a simple description of a mountain, for it speaks more of the difficulty of understanding than the presence of things themselves. Though the existence of the mountain is tacitly acknowledged, this difficulty, the limitation of our horizons and our finite determinacy, the difficulty of knowing something far away or up close. Far away is the Western methodology or approach or way, and close up or up close is the Chinese native scholars, constitutes the challenge of China studies as it does all other humanistic disciplines. We need both approaches. And last here he says, but it also encourages us to open up to different perspectives and other views, to look from various angles, to judge all with a set of intellectual criteria that transcends group allegiances and local identities, and to reach what might be a closer approximation of Mount Lu or whatever it is that we set out to study. So in short, and finally, he advocates the approach of having both ways, both understanding. We use the Western methodologies, but supported by Chinese understanding and Chinese perspective. The way Chinese people lived their history, experienced it, understood it. I think I am done. If you have any questions, please, it's your time to ask questions. If there is any slides you would like to have a look, any quote you want to read, let me know.
Okay, this is Michelle. Thank you so much.
Hello.
This was fascinating.
Oh, thank
you. A couple of questions. So you compared China really to the West, and basically when we talk about Western, and you made the distinction before between countries in Europe and the United States and, you know, North America.
Yeah.
Do you think it's then fair to do the comparison so much with, you know, China and the West? Should it be China and the United States, or China and North America versus China in Europe?
Well, very good question. And yes, of course. As I said, they look at China as, it's not I, of course, it's not I, it's the French and American scholars. They look at China as the l'autre, the other of what is non-Western. But again, like here, Foucault, he called it heterotopia and difference, Derrida said, and so on. But of course, you are right. The West itself is so different. And there is here when I showed scholars here, like this French Tocqueville, taking France, England, America as an example, and this one, Jacobs, taking China, Japan, and Europe. But again, Europe is too big for a comparison. I agree with you. It's too wide. It's too Europe. Which part of Europe do you mean? It's too wide.
Right.
India and Western, but maybe it depends also maybe on the topic you are discussing. Because you can't compare China, Japan, and Europe. Everything in China, everything in no. Definitely, they are using one thing. Definitely, they are picking one tiny phenomenon. For example, drinking tea. Okay, drinking
Right.
or even this in Europe will not match, because in Europe they will have different customs, different tradition. Yeah, I find it's too wide. I agree with you. It's too wide. It's of course it's better to select just one country in Europe, one country in the West, France, England, Germany, because they are totally different. Totally different. Maybe unless we talk about religion, for example, maybe something that most of European countries share. In this case, it will make sense.
Okay.
Like Christianity, for example, at a certain period of time, certain time in history, for example, religion in Europe, in Japan, in China, at a certain time, in the 17th century, for example, or then maybe in this case. So it always depends on the topic, on the comparison unit. Yeah.
Okay.
Good point. Yeah. Yeah.
My second question would be around the phenomenon of virtual reality. I can understand that in order to become an insider or to understand a perspective from an insider point of view, it is best to probably go there. That term Gimba, go there, observe it, and become immersed in it. Do you think this is possible with virtual reality today? Would it be comparable of being there and being immersed by using this virtual reality technology?
It's also a very critical question. Again, also it depends on the topic or why you need to be there. Why you need to be there. If, for example, if the main idea is to understand the native culture and to absorb it, to really feel it, to really experience it, of course, here virtual reality cannot compensate, cannot make it up. To be there, to be yourself there in person as an insider, to try everything firsthand. This is something very important. The virtual reality here, the technology, I don't think it will be enough. It will help those who can't go. Those who can't go, it will help. But in other way, it depends on the topic. But if the topic, for example, if the topic you just following the news or collecting some news, then I don't think you need to be there. Like, for example, sometimes when I think about this spy, the intelligence activities. In the past, until maybe the 70s and 80s, and maybe even the 90s, before the internet, for one country to hire a spy, to employ a spy, to use a spy, that person, that spy has to be inside the other country, the target country. He has to be there, and he has to write reports and send reports by this invisible ink and all of that. But nowadays, all these are primitive things. All these are primitive. This technology with this virtual reality we have, you don't have to have somebody over there, because you get all the news you want online. But of course, there are certain type of news that you need a certain person in a certain place to get this type of news. It's classified, top secret news, classified news. Here you need to implant that person in a government office, for example, or something like that. So it depends on the mission, why you need to be there. In my opinion, it depends on why you need to be there. If you want to be there in order to study the language, of course, you have to be there in person. If you want to be there in order to write a book about the social behavior of people, then you better be there. It's not enough to gather this information online. You need to get this information firsthand.
Right. But unfortunately, we have the inaccurate perceptions that we have because we are not there, and we do use these other forms of medium to get our information. And so we've got just a quandary.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle.
So, Dr. Gouda.
Hello.
Hi, I have a very brief question. That is, as you can see that nowadays, when we are talking about China and the West, it seems that China can represent the East. So I'm wondering, what is your understanding, whether China represents the East, or the East contains a bigger connotations, which includes also Korea maybe, or Japan maybe? What is your understanding of this?
Yeah, of course. Well, if we say China represents the East, then we mean the Far East. We don't mean the Middle East. We don't mean the Near East. The Near East is the North African countries like Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia. This is Near East. The Middle East is another part, in the Gulf area, for example, Palestine and so on. But when you say China, if I make a comparison between China as a representative of the East and England, for example, as a representative of the West, then I know China here, the East here means the Far East. And the West here, England, if it represents the West, it means Western Europe. It doesn't mean Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, they have different, completely different culture. Sometimes they're quite the opposite. So, and again, it depends on the unit, the comparison unit. If that comparison, if we say, for example, China will represent the East in blah, 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 whatever. If that thing also is adopted in Japan and Korea, if they are adopted and practiced, let's say using chopstick, for example, chopsticks, okay? The way of eating, for example, then yes, it's used in Korea and Japan. So if we say China represents the East, meaning the Far East, then yeah, it's valid. It's valid. But if we use something that's not used at all in Japan, it's not practiced in Japan and Korea, then I think it will not be proper to say here China represents the East, because in Japan they do it differently. In Korea they do it differently. So I think we need to look at for example, the filial piety. Like last week we talked about the Asian filial piety and how they care for elderly, and in Western societies, for example, how they just drop their grandparents in elderly houses. Here we can take China as an example of the East, yes, because I think they are here very close. The culture is so close, whether it's Japanese, Korean, Chinese, or even Indian, or even Arabic culture, if you go to the Middle East, you will find also this filial piety is still there, very strong. So we can here take China as a representative of the East, yes, not only the Far East, but the whole East.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Much clearer now.
Thank you.
A quick question. Do you consider that arrogance you talked about to be imperialism?
Arrogance, you mean this socialist studies, arrogance, the Western arrogance?
Yes.
As part of, maybe it's an outcome, yeah, residue, or the residue of the Western imperialism. Yes, sometimes really some Western people, they talk and behave as though they still live in the 19th century. Some
Yes,
of them give me,
I agree.
some of them, yeah, some of them give me this impression that they still live in the 19th century, and so long as they are white, then they must be correct. So yes, this arrogance could be just the residue of their old imperialism. I agree.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michelle. Any more questions? Okay, if there is no more questions, then next week we'll talk about, is it language? I think talk about language and the value of culture, something, cultural value, something like that. Let me.
Great. Looking very much forward to it.
Cultural values. Next week we'll talk about cultural values. Yeah.
Okay.
Cultural values. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
all. Thank you all. See you next week.
Okay.
See you.
See you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.